Welcome back. Well, that's our next focus here today, and we're joined by Dr. Tunji Ogunyemi, who is a budget historian and an economist. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you so much.
Well, so far, cutting the cost of governance, are we on the same page in the first instance, you think, about what it means to cut the cost of governance? I mean, talking about across board governance now.
Actually, when you speak about governance and the cost of governance, you go straight into looking at the budgeting profile of the country. And what you do is that you look at the recurrent expenditure vis-a-vis the capital expenditure. In this year, for example, the total budget is 4.49 trillion. And out of that, 4 trillion goes into recurrent expenditure. That tells you clearly that 88% of the total income of the government, so the total expenditure of government this year alone.
That's at the center?
Yes, at the center. Will go into consumption.
Okay, I ask that because, I mean, a lot of focus at the center. Are the states also keen into this, or they just think, well, the focus is on the center. Let me do what I can do here. It doesn't matter.
Yes, the states are keen in. And I give a very good example. It's Osun State. And that's one of the reasons why Osun State is being, I would say, advisedly, being wrongly criticized because on grounds of not being able to pay salaries. The reason is that the state has been able to balance its expenditure in such a way that not all that government earns goes into recurrent expenditure for paying salaries and overhead costs. The government of that state insists that it will not pay more than 35%, it will not spend less than 35% of its income on capital expenditure. And so, what that means is that less and less will go into consumption. But people don't like that.
Well, how are they doing that? Because, I mean, if you're saying you pay the workers half of their salaries just by fiat, it doesn't work that way.
Oh, yes, of course, it doesn't work that way. But you can go by looking at that cost of governance with respect to recurrent expenditure. You cut it down by looking at ghost workers. That's number one. And in fact, Osun State government discovered about 12 different schools that exist only on paper. And they had to cancel. And these schools had principal, had teachers, had secondary school students, and you were paying them for years, and they've been paying since 1999.
When did they discover
and they never existed. And they discovered this in the year 2012. The government came into power in 2011 November, and 2010 November.
So ever since.
And so to cut that cost of governance, government had to look into recurrent expenditure. That's number one. Number two is to look at corruption in terms of how you transfer money to the salary account, and then cost of governance with respect to overhead costs. So if government had been able to do that, you block leakages and you transfer it to the building of roads, to the building of schools, and to the building of bridges. And this will create more jobs. Now, the creme de la creme society, those people that were benefiting from that system, never liked it. So blackmail.
How come the governor was embarking on projects if there was no money?
Of course, he could embark on projects by simply going for bonds. He could finance his projects going for loans.
How are you going to finance those loans, service those loans, if you don't have funds for it?
Don't forget, banks also know about the income of the states. And banks look at your revenue profile. It is not only cash in hand that you borrow against. You can borrow against your capacity to earn. And so the state could borrow against its capacity to earn. Take, for instance, the income of the state 2 years ago was 2.2 billion naira every month from the federation account, 2.2 billion naira. Now it has been reduced now to about 446 million.
How about the IGR?
The IGR of the state is less than 200 million naira in a year, a month.
So is it on that strength that you say they will go for the bonds?
Of
with
course.
a dwindling income from the center and dwindling IGR?
And there's nothing wrong in the state borrowing. It's absolutely in order, especially if the terms of borrowing are soft.
You know, let us focus more, I mean, on this cutting cost of governance and looking at it on a more general scale. You know, the facts, he's quoting figures right now, and those figures are not before us. And I think that Osun State is not exactly in focus right now. We're looking at cutting the cost of governance in general. And the initial question was whether or not we're all on the same page. The report we played earlier was talking about the emolument of lawmakers in the National Assembly, and some people say that that is totally unjustifiable. What is your take on it?
Absolutely, I agree. I can't agree more, because 120 billion naira is earmarked this year. Don't forget, the original amount was 150 billion naira in the budget. In the 4.4 trillion naira budget, 150 billion naira was earmarked to be paid as for the expenditure of the National Assembly. But it's been reduced after the approval of the budget to 120 billion. Now, that goes to about 255 million naira per legislator. And that's absolutely unrealistic.
100 and how much did you say?
120 billion naira is in the budget for the National Assembly in the year 2015.
So it was initially 150.
It was initially 150 billion.
So they had a pay cut.
Yeah, no. When the budget was to be proposed, the executive insisted that 150 billion naira would be on the high side. And so the National Assembly agreed. Of course, there can be negotiations outside of the scene to reduce the budget to 120 billion naira. Originally, the budget of the National Assembly, with the same number of men and women in the National Assembly, 109 in the Senate, 360 in the House of Representatives, during President Obasanjo's era was just about 40 billion. Now, how it jumped to 100 billion? I mean, only God knew that.
Yeah, but they say that it's not just the senators and the members of the House of Reps.
I mean, it's not rocket science. There are 7 expenditure heads with respect to the National Assembly. Only 7 expenditure heads. Number 1 head, the Senate. Number 2, the House of Representatives. Number 3, the National Assembly Service Commission. Number 4, the National Assembly Management. Number 5, the National Institute of Legislative Studies. Number 3, the aides. The aides, you pay the aides. And number 7, of course, got to do with public complaint or something like that. These are the 7 expenditure heads. But of course, these expenditure heads are only support staff, support institution for the purposes of making law. And so you don't pay your support staff more than you are paying the people actually doing the law. It doesn't make sense.
So when you did the breakdown, in terms of how much each legislature earns, did you factor in all of this other support staff, and what did you come up with?
Check out Section 162, Sub 2 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Empowers the Revenue Mobilization, Allocation and Fiscal Commission to set salaries of the President, people in the National Assembly, state governors, etc., etc. And the expenditure, the RMAFC set 2.4 million for the senators. 2.4 million. I think the problem...
When was this? The current one or previous?
Of course, RMAFC.
But you hear them tell us that they earn their basic salary is just about 1 million.
No, that cannot be true. The basic salary of the National Assembly senators, as we have in Nigeria today, is 2.453 million. That's the basic salary. Now, there are 15 different kinds of allowances. Furniture allowances will be 300% of that basic. Motor car vehicle allowances will be 400% of that basic. Constituency allowances 200% of that basic. Newspaper allowances, 60% of that basic. Leave allowances, 10% of that basic. They also go on recess. Recess allowance, can you imagine? The National Assembly will go on recess and you pay them for going on recess. 10% of that basic allowances. I mean, it's a harvest of allowances.
So if we look at all of this now, because I'm trying to look at some of the figures that has to do with periodicals and newspapers, talking about wardrobe and looking at the total allowance, as well as a couple of other things. Now, if we have to look at them bit by bit, since our focus now is on cutting costs.
Across board.
Now, let's look at newspapers and periodicals, which they have also put here before getting into the wardrobe, and see the amount of newspapers and periodicals that will amount to what we are seeing here. Given the fact that we now have online publications and so many other things, and they have aides that can go through some of these and come and tell them what they have been able to glean, do you think this is also feasible for us to have this huge amount on periodicals and newspapers for the National Assembly members?
Absolutely necessary. Absolutely.
Now, by the way, they're talking about that is 10% of their annual basic salary for newspapers and periodicals. And for instance, for the Senate, for the senators, they are taking 202,000. While the National Assembly members are taking 198,000 annually for papers and periodicals. So let's start, because this seems to be the lowest so far. So we're starting from the lowest and we go up. Now, what would be your advice if we're talking about cost, cutting costs for the National Assembly members looking at periodicals?
The Senate of the Federal Republic even made an attempt. I mean, looking at that harvest, the harvest of allowances, made an attempt by setting up an ad hoc finance committee under the Honorable Senator, the distinguished Senator James Manager. And that committee, ad hoc committee, turned up a report and recommended, without mincing words, that it's high time the Senate cut its income or cut its revenue or remuneration, if you like, by 50%.
From what to what?
So that's the senators
that the senators already have set up a committee
with that kind of recommendation.
because it's scandalous.
I mean.